the bare minimum of effort in recognizing the context of our collective history. As students and practitioners of a field that prides itself in synthesizing considerations of culture, history, and place, among others, we would be remiss to not recognize in just a little bit more detail the context in which we find ourselves today. The Tutelo people were driven from their lands here in the late 17th century as English colonization extended into Appalachia. They were adopted by the Cayuga of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in current-day New York State, where they were nearly exterminated and once again driven from their land in the Sullivan Campaign of 1779. The descendants of the Tutelo today make their home among the Six Nations of the Grand River near Toronto. The Monacan people, enduring centuries of erasure and colonial occupation in Virginia, were only recently in 2018 recognized by the federal government after a nearly 20-year campaign for recognition. They are one of 7 Virginia tribes recognized by the federal government and another 4 tribes recognized by the state of Virginia. As a land-grant university, Virginia Tech has not only benefited from the ancestral Tutelo and Monacan lands on which its 2,600-acre campus sits, it has also benefited and continues to benefit from the expropriation and sale of nearly 300,000 acres of indigenous land across 14 states under the Morrill Act of 1862, which provided the seed capital for federal land-grant universities. It is this history that we should not only reflect on passively, but recognize ourselves as active participants in. And it is this shared history that traces the path to where we find ourselves today, grappling with compounding and intertwined crises, environmental, social, political, and existential. Chris Cornelius's work as an architect explores this collective history and its subsequent present through the lens of his indigenous culture and upbringing and his education in the modernist architectural tradition. As much artist as architect, his work compels us through the intrigue of his richly layered multimedia drawings, the care and craft of his exploratory models, the creative use of materials and consideration of site in his work, and the thorough comprehension of impact and relations in his thinking. While indigenous perspectives have often been relegated to a distant and mythic past, Chris's consideration of materials, occupants, landscape, and wildlife, among others, as interrelated characters within a complex world speaks as much, I think, to the world of immersive digital networks and changing global paradigms as it does to ecological entanglement and indigenous histories. Chris was a collaborating designer with Antoine Predock on the Indian Community School of Milwaukee, which won the AIA Design Excellence Award from the Committee on Architecture for Education. He is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the inaugural Miller Prize, a 2018 Architects Newspaper Best of Design Award, and an Artists in Residence Fellowship from the National Museum of the American Indian. He has been exhibited widely, including the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale, and is the Karen Lewis Icahn Visiting Assistant Professor at the Yale School of Architecture. So without further ado, it is with great pleasure that I welcome our guest this evening, Professor Chris Cornelius.
Wat kuf nuela du, Chris Nyongets, Aquahoni Wagita Loda, Okale Oniata Aga, the Wagadon Choda. So I introduced myself in the Oneida language. I said that I am Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan. Or I extend my greetings, thankfulness, and love to all of you. I'm Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan, and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. So tonight I'm going to share not only work, but I want to share a bit about how I think about the work and how I think about indigenous design, and what sort of contextualizes that. Because for me, using indigeneity and design and balancing that with how I've been educated in this typical sort of Western architectural education, how do I balance those things? And so I begin with this. as architecture students, we learn about this usually in our history or theory courses, the Venturi, Scott Brown, Duck, and Decorated Shed. So when I started to examine Native architecture when I was starting graduate school at the University of Virginia, I started to look at how architecture was being made for Native people at the end of the 20th century. And what I was finding is that there were basically kind of two categories that you could place these buildings within. One is the zoomorph, that is the buildings that look like animals. So this is actually the elementary school on my reservation, the Oneida Reservation near Green Bay, Wisconsin. It's a turtle. The turtle is significant in our culture, but this building is, everything about it is a turtle. The gym is in the head. It has eyes that are made out of tiles, and you can see the feet and a tail. So I associated that with the duck. And then the other type of building that I was seeing is what I would call the pictograph. It's a sort of normal building, but it has iconography applied to it. And so in a lot of ways, if we thought about how culture and indigeneity sort of overlap the idea of the sign or message that Venturi and Scott Brown were talking about, that's where I started to draw these parallels. But for me as a designer, I thought there has to be a better way to do both of these things, or that there has to be a better way to be able to design and translate the culture through architecture to make this spatially experiential. How do we begin to experience the culture through architecture? And so that's what I wanted to do. The other theme or thought that I wanted to share with you that sort of inspires me and the way that I think about the work is that when Indigenous people see the landscape, they often will associate it with a story or talk about what they see. So this geological formation here in the Southwest, there are 4 languages, the 4 groups that are indigenous to that area. Basically, they all translate into bear's ears. When you look at these formations, if you could imagine a bear that's like partially submerged, that's why it kind of looks like that. But these stories are embedded with, I think, with science, geology, history, culture, language, all sorts of things. And I began to think about, what if architecture could do the same thing? What if we could begin to see architecture in the same way that Indigenous people see the landscape? And could we begin to tell our own stories with contemporary artifacts? So I'm going to share 3 themes with you that are kind of in my work and sort of sort the work out for me. I started this when I had a solo exhibition at the University of Arkansas, which I had sort of 3 gallery spaces to organize the work. But the first is design as ceremony. The idea that design is a ceremony, it's a ritual, it's embedded with other things. And so it's not a task, right? I'm not seeing it as a task. I'm seeing it as a ritual. And so if we thought of design in that way, when we were thinking about how we're putting physical things into the landscape, that's how I would like to think about this idea of design is ceremony. So in the Indian Community School of Milwaukee, which is a pre-K through 8 private school in Franklin, Wisconsin, just southwest of Milwaukee. The students only have to prove Native ancestry to attend the school. Antoine Predock was selected as the design architect through an invited competition, and the clients wanted an Indigenous designer on the team as well. So that's when I joined the team and became a collaborating designer with Antoine Predock. The school occupies almost 200 acres in this sort of landscape. Some of it is former farm field, some of it is untouched. And so this building that we called it an animal for basically the entire project, right? We didn't really call it a building. We called it the animal because it has to negotiate the site differences. We wanted it to sit into the landscape like an animal. We wanted the thing to begin to occupy this landscape as if it had kind of always been there. And the school had asked us to design a building that was a 100-year building, that it would be there in 100 years. So we began to think about all of the sort of cultural aspects of it, and that was kind of my role. There are 11 tribes in Wisconsin. They are basically in 5 sort of cultural groups. We have some similarities and we have some differences. for instance, some animals might show up in our clan structures, but not in others, but they might show up in stories. So we had to develop a series of cultural values that we wanted to think about. So we started to think about things like migration. The idea that there's this ritual that happens at the school twice a day. It's a big event, right? Students come into the school and students come out of the school. So we began to think about that as a connective sort of thing within the school. This is the second story where the middle school grades 6, 7, and 8 are. And this floor is about the sky. The roof sort of pulls apart like clouds, letting light through them into this particular space. The tree columns that you see were harvested from the Menominee Nation of Wisconsin. The trees are very important to the Menominee people. They're indigenous to Wisconsin, and so when the trees are harvested, they were harvested in a ceremony. They gave their lives to the school, and they hold stories. These trees are, some of them are over 300 years old. They hold stories that are pre-European contact. They hold stories, and they're there to tell us those stories within the school. So you see these tree columns throughout the project. But one of the things we started to think about was, could we begin to think about everything that's connected between the site and the moon? And so I started to investigate that and to graphically represent that. So I started with the things that burrow into the ground, starting to think about what are the lessons from animals that we could learn, the animals that go into the ground, from that surface, going up, birds that fly in the sky, migratory birds, things like butterflies. I didn't know that butterflies migrated at 1,000 feet. And the idea or notion too that there's airlines, traffic that goes over, seasonal winds, where the weather is in our atmosphere, where space travel usually happens within our atmosphere, all the way up to the moon. Because if we're thinking about this thing as a continuity, we thought about the project as having that continuity that is actually connected to all of those things. And we have to examine all of those things in order to think about that actual connection. So one of the big things that in indigenous culture that I think is really important to understand is this idea of relationality, meaning that we're actually related. And so we talk about the landscape as if we are related in a familial way. The earth is our mother. The moon is our grandmother. We think about the trees as our cousins. The stones are our grandfathers. And we see all living things as being related to one another. So we started to examine the program of the building through these cultural values. And then what we wanted to do, we removed all of the institutional labels. So we never called the place that they eat the cafeteria. We didn't call it the lobby. We called it community. We didn't call it the theater. We call it drum. And the school still uses these terms and talks about it. So in that way, we're starting to develop its own mythology, starting to tell its own stories to the students, and they begin to recognize that as how they connect with nature, how they connect with their culture. Even the classrooms, even though they have numbers because they have to by code, but they actually have names like turtle and wetland and sweetgrass, and so they're associated with trees and medicines and animals. The second story, all of the classrooms are named after things in the sky like rain and thunder. So they associate their classrooms by those names. They don't associate them with numbers. So again, removing that sort of institutional aspect of it. So here's another piece that we know as architectural educators and students, Loger's frontispiece. And in this piece, we see the architect pointing at nature and seeing nature in a way that it is a kind of resource for the architecture. That this is what I've done with this resource. And I oppose that with what indigenous architecture actually is, and how it is sympathetic to nature, how it is intended to be from nature and to return to nature, that those ideas are actually part of that connectivity. And the differences between these two images for me as an indigenous designer is that nature in this one is a commodity. It's there as a resource to be utilized in the production of architecture. Here it is a relationship. If we thought about buildings as if we were related to them, we would think about them differently, right? We would think about them in ways that we hadn't really ever thought about. We would think about the materials that we're making, are putting into the building, the people that make the materials, the people that install the materials, the people that clean the buildings. All of these things are interconnected, and we should be thinking about them as a relationship. So for me, the other difference between these two things is that the difference between nature is mine and nature is me, that I'm actually connected to that thing, right? I'm connected to the architecture. And so when I put it into the world, I'm actually putting one of my relatives into the world. That's how we should be thinking about, I think that's how we should be thinking about architecture. So in this regard, in indigenous culture, we talk about the plants as our oldest relatives. They teach us things. They nourish us. They are medicines. They've been through droughts and other sorts of things. They're our oldest relatives. I think buildings are our youngest relatives. If we thought about them, we would take better care of them. We would place them into the landscape with care. They consume. They breathe. They sweat. They poop. They need a lot of care. And we should be thinking about that. And when we're putting these things into the landscape, whether it's a landscape or it's a city, it's the same thing. For me, I don't think that there's urbanity is not anti-indigenous. I think that we should be thinking about these things in urban settings as well, not just ex-urban sites, but that's true of urban sites as well. So there was a time when I didn't have a lot of commissioned work, so I started to build these models and I started to speculate on. And what I wanted to do was kind of remove this idea or notion that everything is a metaphor for something else or everything's an analog for something else. And I started to think about the idea or notion that what if I could create an architecture where I wanted to be ambiguous about who created it, what created it? Was it a person? Was it an animal? What is their understanding of nature? Is this a dwelling? So I removed this idea of program from it as well. And so I started to make this series of models, and largely I was interested in the materiality of these things too. They're made out of brass, bronze, copper, brass mesh, copper mesh. And I was interested in soldering these forms and patining the metals and connecting them. But I was also interested in how they sit into these sort of landscapes. And I started to cast these plaster landscapes. But I used these found boxes as sites, because I started to think about the idea that when we're given a site as a designer, we can't change that thing. It has a history. It's a given size. So this particular thing happens to be a sewing machine base that I found that I cast this landscape in. This particular piece is called Moonscope. It's a device for seeing the moon. This one is called Bivouac. It's an impromptu dwelling in this plaster sort of landscape. And in these pieces too, I started to think about the idea of the scale figure, but not having it be a person, to have it be an animal. I kind of want technology and time to be ambiguous. So I started to think of them as architectural fiction, the way that we think about science fiction, right? Science fiction has enough science in it to be plausible, but then enough sort of fantasy and fiction in it to be entertaining. These are architectural fiction. So I was building this sort of world where I wasn't quite clear about how these things worked. Some of them have drawings that they started from drawings. Some of them didn't. Some of them, like this one in particular, is what I would call a three-dimensional sketch. I kind of put it together and designed it as I was making it. And then some like these, they started out with drawings and started to develop from there. I started to think about all the different ways that I could make these things that were a box, things that were a tower, things with an inverted, got smaller and bigger. The other one here is moon shades. It's a place to sit and see the moon in that found box. I had to make a moon so that you could begin to see it. But this whole idea of how these things were connected, to me, I started to think about producing this series of pieces that again was speculating on who or what made that thing, and not being particularly clear. So in 2018, I received an artist residency at Bookworm Gardens in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, just 45 minutes north of Milwaukee, where I am. It's a children's literature garden. So the proposal that I wrote was that I wanted to examine the role of the trickster in native storytelling. The trickster has a very important role in the storytelling. It's usually associated with an animal. Sometimes it's some other phenomena in indigenous cultures, but it's there to teach us about our own humanity. It's there to teach us about the ways that we act. So sometimes the trickster is greedy or wants some sort sort of valor or consumes too much. Like all of those lessons are embedded in that. So this piece is what is the Trickster. It won the 2018 Architects Newspaper Best of Design Award for temporary installation. And this is it in the garden. I made it from trees that are harvested from the site. I wanted to completely subvert the ideas of form and program. So it didn't have a program. I don't know if it's a pavilion, it's a structure, it's a sculpture, it's all of those things. And so the Trickster also allows me to speak through it as a character. And so what I wanted young children to do when they're visiting this garden is to begin to think about this thing and then tell their own stories about it. There was a young woman that I met as I was making the thing. She didn't know that I was the one making it, but she told me, like, I said, well, what do you think that is? And she said, well, it looks like it's from a movie that I don't know what it is yet, or it looks like animals came first and then people came. That's exactly what I wanted to have happen, right? To begin to sort of to defy categorization. It has a subtitle called "It's Not a Teepee," because as I was making the thing, everyone asked me if it's a teepee. It's not a teepee. So that is this is the piece. It was there for about 2 years. It's made of copper mesh. The same exact copper mesh that I used on the models. So I began to think about this idea of, like, how do I translate the physical models into a full scale thing? And as I was beginning to think about that, when I was making the models, I started to think about the idea of regalia and the importance of regalia in our culture and indigenous culture. That regalia is not only aesthetic and ornamental, it actually signifies other things. It signifies your place in life, your accomplishments, what you've been through. So on the right is a traditional Haudenosaunee headdress called the Gistoe. And in our confederacy, the Oneida, Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Tuscarora, I think that's all of them. Seneca, I said Seneca, right? We have feather configurations that tell which tribe you belong to. So this one is Mohawk. It has 3 feathers up. And if you're Oneida, you have 2 feathers up and 1 feather down. The fact that you're a chief is signified by the antlers. So I started to think architecture should have regalia. We should be thinking about architecture having regalia. It is like hyper ornament. It is not just sort of ornamental. So that's the things that I started to place on the model, and then I put on the actual piece on the Trickster. This is a film that was made in its first winter while it was in place at Oklahoma Gardens. So my friends at Spirit of Space made the film, and they just sent me an email message one day. They said, well, Chris, we want to film this thing in the snow. And I said, go for it. I didn't really tell them like how to film it. And then they're amazing storytellers. They actually showed me things about the thing that I hadn't thought about. I hadn't thought about the regalia and the pine needles having a connection. I love the way that they shot it, because it looks like it's an animal that if you get too close to it, they might scare it away. It's just 1 minute sort of clip, and it's really quite amazing. So I made a second Trickster when I won the Knoll Fellowship. It's an artist fellowship here in the Milwaukee area. I won the fellowship for established artists. They give 2 established artists and 3 emerging artists fellowships, and then there's a group exhibition of all 5. And so in this case, I decided to make a second Trickster that I sort of expanded this idea of the regalia, because it was inside, it was outside. the Trickster is very proud to have won this award and be in this exhibition. It stands very tall. It has the most space out of the exhibition, more space than most every other piece within it. The trees that are used here were harvested from the Linden Sculpture Garden, people that help facilitate the Knoll Fellowship. But again, it's made out of copper mesh. And I began to think about how was I going to translate what I was doing in the model with this wire, which was originally this idea, a notion about like, how do I complete this thing? How's the top sort of work? And I started to think about insects or bugs or whatever sort of flying around this thing. And so translating that into the full scale thing. I really am at this moment sort of compelled by the idea of like the connection between my drawings, the models, and the one-to-one scale physical things, that in these cases, it's not a full scalar relationship, meaning like in architecture, we make a drawing, we make a model that's a small scale version of a building, right? That there is a dialogue between all of these things. So while these pieces are inspired by these models, they're not the full scale translation of them. The models help me sort of generate ideas. And then when I build this installation, I don't produce a set of drawings for it because I'm building it. And then when I'm applying the copper mesh, in this case, in both Tricksters, I thought about it in the first one and then again in the second one, I feel like I'm making a shirt for a giant bear because I have this huge thing that I'm trying to wrap this copper mesh around. I'm trying to conceal some of the seams. I'm trying to conceal the fasteners. Its body is sort of weirdly shaped and oddly shaped. I'm just trying to get this material onto the thing. I don't have, again, a set of drawings or plans. It kind of tells me what it wants to be. And in the building of these things, that is where this sort of ceremony is. There's a reciprocity between me and the thing. Because I'm not just creating the thing. I think that the thing starts to speak to me. In this case, these trees most of them, all three, there's three main ones. They're over 30 feet tall. When I started to erect this thing, it told me where it wanted to go because of gravity. It had its own weight. When I started to apply other pieces to it, it started to do the same thing. And again, while I was applying the cladding or the copper mesh. So again, this Trickster allows me to speak through the piece. And the Trickster wants to remind you that you're on indigenous land, that even your institutions of higher learning and your art museums are on indigenous land. So this is at the Haggerty Museum at Marquette University. And so he wants to remind you, he, she, it doesn't really, I mean, pronouns for the piece or for the Trickster don't really apply because it can be either or. In this case, I began to think about this particular piece having a sort of personality that it was very proud again to have won this award and be in this exhibition. It allowed me to kind of have it show this other personality. So that's where the antlers kind of came from. Is it a part of a trophy that the Trickster has won, or we don't know if it got it legitimately or not. Right. And so in 2016, I was asked to, I was one of 10 designers selected for the Miller Prize competition. And in that competition, we were all competing for 5 different sites. On the 5 sites, the prize is the budget to build an installation. So it was basically a head-to-head sort of competition. We were assigned the sites, and the site that I got was the First Christian Church by Eliel Saarinen and his son Errol Saarinen. They had started a practice when they started this commission. The Saarinen Church occupies about one city block. It's a church and a school. One of the first modernist church in the country, I think, and definitely one of the first pieces in Columbus, Indiana, and was kind of started the architectural program in Columbus. If you don't know about Columbus, Indiana, it's an amazing place, full of modernist architecture. There's an I.M. library across the street. He did that early in his career. There are a number of Errol Saarinen projects, and Errol Saarinen designed the house for the Millers, who ran the Cummins Diesel. That's kind of why Columbus exists, is the Cummins Diesel factory. But in this competition, what I wanted to do is to draw attention to the people that were indigenous to that land. In Indiana, this is a place where that history was erased very quickly. It was kind of difficult to find that. So I had to do some research. I used some resources that I have at the Idle Jorg Museum in Indianapolis. And so it's the Miami or Miami people that were indigenous to this landscape. And like many cities in the US, this was a place of meeting and where multiple tribes kind of came together and where they started to trade with Europeans. That culture, the Miami, are a wigwam building culture, like many Great Lakes area cultures. And so the wigwam is a sapling that is bent over into this dome shape and then is clad with reed mats or bark shingles. And I started to think about the traditional arts of the Miami, this ribbon cutting on the right, and how it's an interesting sort of pattern. They often talk about it like it's almost like a moire pattern where there's multiple patterns that overlay and start to another pattern starts to emerge out of that. But when we think about indigenous art, how we should be thinking about it is not as what it stands for as much as what all of it can encompass. And oftentimes it's an abstraction of nature. And so I started to think about the feathers of an eagle, right? The feathers on an eagle are very different. They're like high performance, right? The tail feathers are very different than the feathers that are on the chest, on the neck, on the head. All of that is for it to be super efficient, right? And so I started to think about this sort of cladding. So the triangles and the pattern, the diamond pattern in the art can be eagle feathers, it could be fish scales, it could be other sorts of things that you begin to see in nature. Wikiami is sited on First Christian Church, National Historic Landmark designed by Eero Saarinen and Eliel Saarinen, his father. It's really a significant piece here in Columbus, and so I'm very happy to have Wikiami on the site at First Christian Church. Wikiami is the Miamia word for wigwam, which was a traditional dwelling of the Miami people. So I wanted to address the indigenous people of Indiana, particularly this area. And I wanted to make a structure that addressed how Native people see the world, see nature, see building. So what I tried to do is to look at the original wigwam structure. What are the constituent parts of that? Why did they use those pieces? So it was originally a round sort of structure that they used wood saplings that they put into the ground and then bent over to create a dome sort of shape and then clad it with mats or bark. So what I tried to do is to look at how those original structures were made and then to do that in a contemporary way using modern materials. The structure is steel rebar that is welded together, and then the outside is an expanded steel skin to allow some transparency. Sometimes it looks very veil-like. You can see right through it, and then different parts of the day when light is on it, it looks a little bit more opaque. I did read some of Eliel Saarinen's writing, and he talks about nature and how architecture can be sympathetic to nature. The trees here make a very dense canopy. With the exception of this one corner, there's a kind of cavity within that canopy, and so that's kind of why the piece actually leans forward a bit. It kind of leans over the walk and to tuck it into the trees and to not really disturb any of the site. We built a wood form on scaffolding that was CNC cut, and then we had a company in Indianapolis bend the rebar in the elliptical shapes for the horizontals, and those were welded together. And I had a great crew of guys from Forcia, which is a local company here, that volunteered their time. They're excellent craftsmen, excellent workers, so they helped develop a system for putting these rings on, welding the verticals together, and to help put the panels on. So, you know, people made this, even though the panels are water jet cut and we parametrically figured them out. Human hands made this thing. That to me, there was a correspondence to how people made buildings and how people are still making buildings today. So the piece was, we completed it in August of 2017, was the first iteration of the Miller Prize. They had the second iteration in 2019. They're about to have the third iteration this summer, 2021. Originally was supposed to be part of this, just a 3-month exhibition, but ended up being there for almost 2 years. Church was very happy with the piece, and on the church property. They used it for many different things. The library across the street used it for storytelling. There was a dance company that choreographed a piece around it. So the exterior cladding, I like to think of it as the feathers. It's this idea that there's a sort of cladding. What kind of things can we learn about that from nature to begin to think about these things? So the piece is oriented to the sun because it would be there during the fall equinox. The top is sort of sloped for that, and the door opening is pointing towards that as well. So on that morning, it has the maximum amount of sunlight within the entire thing because it's coming through the door and the top. So again, I think of it as an animal. It rests at night. It didn't have any kind of lighting on it. People again used it in different ways, and has a sort of had a presence in Columbus, and I'm very happy to have had that piece there. The second theme for me in my work is drawing as medicine. In indigenous culture, the idea of medicine is not just things that like make you physically better, but mentally, they're good for your soul, things and activities that you might do, and not just like plants and medicines in that sort of way. For me, drawing is a part of that ritual of ceremony. It's one of the rituals of ceremony, designing ceremony. So oftentimes my work starts with the drawing. I started to think about how we draw, and that I think we draw in a way that we think, meaning like ideas might not be fully formulated, but they start to get more concrete, and then we start to darken things in. We might start to color things in. They start out very light, and we're just working through things. So what you're seeing are images from my sketchbook, from projects, from other sorts of things, and from travel sketches. I'm always kind of drawing these things, and I fill about two, sometimes 3 of these a year. And so that part is actually part of kind of my own sort of ritual, is this idea of drawing. So when I was the artist in residence for the National Museum of the American Indian, what my proposal was to draw our creation story as an architect would, because for me, that creation story is the specifications of construction for the world. It holds that much truth in it, and it has that kind of it has science in it. I think again, it's embedded within these stories. It's not just a fairy tale or fable. It's actually mythology. It has almost religious truth to us as indigenous people. So in the story, there's a sky world that's set above this world. This world is completely covered in water. The only inhabitants are fish, birds, animals, anything that is around water. In that sky world, there's a white pine in the center of it, a great white pine, and the great ruler he's the chief of the sky world. He gets angry at his wife. He uproots the tree. He throws her down the hole into this world, and so she's called the Sky Woman. She comes down to this world. All of the animals realize that if she hits the water, she won't survive. So a turtle starts to emerge, and they realize that if she hits the turtle shell, she also won't survive. So a muskrat goes down below the water, grabs some mud, puts it on the back of the earth, back on the turtle, and she starts to walk on it, spreads it, and it becomes the world. So this is why you might hear indigenous people refer to the earth as Turtle Island, because it came from that. And so in that story too, she has a daughter, and her daughter has 2 twins, a right-handed and a left-handed twin. They're the ones that create everything in nature. That daughter dies after giving birth to one of them. She's put into the earth, and from that we get the 3 sisters of corn, beans, and squash. So I was trying to like show all of these things in section, in perspective. And when I started to investigate and think, what clues can I learn from the story of how to actually draw this thing? How was I going to draw this section of the sky world in this world? I began to think about things like, how thick is the sky world? The tree tells me how thick it is, because I began to research the root structure of the white pine. How big can it actually get? Because we know that he uproots it and that creates this aperture that she is thrown down through. We don't exactly know the sort of vertical height, but to begin to think about that. So I'm showing it here in axon perspective, section perspective, exploded axon. I'm using all these things, and at the top, I'm using, those are the materials and methods. The muskrat, the sky woman, the Gastolia, the great ruler, the three sisters, the right-handed, left-handed twin. During this process, though, this is when I really started to think about drawing, and that actually being a part of my sort of ritual and idea. So this was in 2003, shortly after I graduated grad school. In this sketchbook, this is like the first time that I stopped erasing things. I don't erase anything in my sketchbooks, but again, because I think we draw how we think. So if it's not quite clear, I don't start with a new blank page. I just keep drawing over it. I think that we're not always using the cognitive parts of our brains as architects that we should. I think that when we start to draw, if we erase it, it gets lost, but I think it came out for a reason. And so that's why I don't erase things. So you'll see here, I'm like planning out how the boards are going to look when I draw them. How am I going to draw the sky world in this white pine? How am I going to draw the turtle? And in this case, I started to think about how was I going to draw that encircling on the earth. She plants strawberry and tobacco, so those crops are kind of like in different stages. You can see here that I started to draw a turtle and I wasn't happy with it. This is where I decided not to erase it. So I went, researched, and looked for an image of a cross section of a turtle and started to draw that. I just redrew it. There's this kind of intensity that gets built in and layering in the drawings from doing these things over and over again. So some of these are notes. I start to take notes out of my own sort of research and drawing comparisons between things like the sky dome that shows up in Haudenosaunee, and in particular in Oneida. Beating patterns is part of that idea of the three sisters and that being part of the earth. And so this is again where I really started to think about this idea of the drawing. So for me, the final pieces and the sketchbook really kind of go together. They work together in a very sort of sympathetic way. This is a project for my own tribe on our reservation. It is a maple sugar camp. Maple sugaring is part of our culture. So every year we gather sap. It's a natural sweetener. We thank the trees for giving that to us. The first clap of thunder is the thing that wakes up the trees, and then they know it's time to give their sap, which should be happening soon. It may have happened already because it's warm days and cold nights that the sap starts to run. So this building is a cordwood masonry structure, which isn't an indigenous building technology. It's just a sort of thing that they wanted to experiment with and to build with the cordwood structure. So it is a place where they boil the sap down, and that process of harvesting the sap and boiling it down is taught to the elementary school. So students come here to learn that process and the ritual. So I started to think about the idea and role of stories in architecture. And so I started to talk about the teacher that teaches this about it. And she said to me, in Oneida, we don't talk about the stories about the sky as much anymore. And I said, oh, really? Can you tell me one of those stories? And she told me the story of the seven dancers. The seven dancers were seven young children that were dancing. They wanted to have their own feast, sort of ritual. They went to their parents. They asked them for food for this feast. Their parents said no. And then they started to dance. Because they were angry, they danced so hard that they went into the sky. And those seven dancers are the Pleiades, the seven stars. And so when we see the Pleiades, when it's directly overhead, when we look straight up into the sky, that signals when our midwinter ceremony happens. And then when you see the Pleiades and you see them flickering, we say that the seven dancers are dancing hard. And I started to think about, what if the architecture was the aperture through which these children danced into the sky? This is how they got into the sky. It also was the technical thing that I needed. I needed a place to exhaust all of the steam that comes off of this process of boiling the sap. But I began to think about this connection again, that the architecture now is a device for me to be able to use to tell this story, so that they can actually tell the story and use the architecture in it. It's not just a setting for the story to happen, that aperture is part of that. Also, it is an aperture through which you can see straight up and to the sky, so that you can see with the Pleiades and when that midwinter ceremony actually happens, so that the thing itself is a device for seeing that, beginning to signal those things. So rituals are signaled by things in nature. I created a series of drawings that I call the moon domiciles. They're not sited on the moon, but they're based on our tribe's moon calendar. I was also interested in this idea again of, can I break this thing where indigenous architecture has to be a metaphor or analog, this like turtle equals school, turtle equals building sort of world. It doesn't have to be a metaphor. Can I embed indigeneity into the architecture in a different way? So our moons have names that are based on different things. And so we're about to hit the maple syrup moon. Again, we're maple syruping, the trees are going to be giving their sap. Some of the moons are about planting strawberries, green beans, green corn, harvesting, resting, the great light and hunting. Like they all have titles or names, and those names are associated with rituals and ceremonies that happen, and the things in nature, like the Pleiades being overhead, signal some of those ceremonies. So I started to think about this architecture that we're not really quite sure who made it, if it's a animal, person, architect, builder, whatever. So I created the series of drawings. There are 13 moons. I have completed 8 of them. I have number 9 in process. The plan is to do all 13, but they all start in my sketchbook in this sort of 4 elevation series. They all have the same mass. They're all displaced from the ground. They all have some sort of head dress or way to address the sky. They have some way of getting into them. Some of them do, some of them don't. But they all have these antennae at the top. They may communicate with one another. Again, I'm trying to be ambiguous about time frame and technology. So when I draw these in my sketchbook, again, this idea of the ritual, the ceremony of drawing, the medicine that is a part of how I make the thing. I'm not erasing anything in these. I'm working off of ideas that the thing starts to tell me what it is. So for instance, when I finish it, there's a sort of process that I go through. I start to draw the light lines on. I splash it with watercolor because I don't want it to be too pristine. And then I start to draw these other things. And at the end, the very last thing I do is draw these circles, ellipse around them. Because to me, when I was done with it, it seemed like, yes, there should be something flying around this. And I don't know if it's a bird, if it's a bug, is it technology, is it Wi-Fi, is it some other sort of signal? Those are the things. And in this particular one, I wondered about the structure. I start to play with what the structure is that's holding the thing up. In this case, it might be legs. Did this thing just run here and stop when I turn to look at it? And is it following me? And then when I was started to make these things, I was making digital models of them as well. And I started to think, why don't I start to change the way that I actually digitally render these things as well? This is one where the structure, I started to think about, what if it was like hair or like porcupine quills? It's something that they're just so dense that they actually hold the structure up instead of a series of columns. And what if I could see into the sky? What if I could see things that are crossing the sky that I wouldn't normally be able to see? Could I have a different kind of vision, kind of like how birds see magnetism when they migrate? And then this one is as I started to think about this idea of like a landscape that this thing sits on. The structure is actually a dense bundle of sticks, but you can see in this image that the bear is pulling out this sort of reservoir to irrigate the landscape. And I just wrote this note. This is the thought that came to me. I can roll out my cloud to make it rain when I need it to rain, right? And so the animals are the ones that are sort of interacting with the architecture here. And then this wing sort of device is the thing that gathers the rainwater. This image won a K-Rod prize for best physical representation, best hand drawing that year. This one is Thunder Moon. It has an apparatus at the top. The thunder might happen while I'm sleeping, so I might need to hear it. And I started to think about so I did, after designing the thing, I started to think about the idea of that sort of apparatus and how a deer's ear is pointed forward because it's a prey and it needs to hear its predators. And so that's why I put it into the drawing. So when I think of these things, I put them into the drawing. I don't sort of edit or parse those things out. Or if I'm making notes, so you can see in the drawings, all of these drawings have what I call under drawings or kind of secret drawings. The drawings that are in there that get covered up or watercolored over, or things that start to get embedded. And here I'm putting a person in it. I'm making some suggestion of a hearth because we're not quite sure whether there's a fire within the thing or not. This is the digital version of it. This one best digital image from the K-Rob Prize. Again, in this case, I'm kind of removing the materiality of it and thinking about it as almost a cosmological thing in itself. We're seeing the sky in an interesting way. This third and last theme that I want to share with you is the idea of decolonization. And I think that in order to understand what decolonization is, we have to really understand what colonization itself is. And it is a system and apparatus. And that apparatus needs to be dismantled. And I think as an Indigenous people, and for me in particular, it's important that I am a part of that system in order to dismantle it. I am in academia. I am in the profession. I can't just be outside and critiquing it, throwing sticks at it, whatever. I need to be able to be a part of it to dismantle it. And we have to understand the system and actually how it works. And so I borrow this system from Linda Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodology. She talks about the vocabulary of colonialism. The first thing is the line, right? The map or the survey of territory, like US, Louisiana Purchase, whatever it is. That sort of thing happens. Drawing the boundary, drawing a border is one of the first things that happens in colonialism. The second thing is the establishment of a center, which is the orientation of power, right? So in Italian cities, they usually put a church, cathedral, whatever, in the middle, because that was the sort of seat of power, creating this capital or center, again, of power. And the third is the idea of the outside, that the territory and people are in oppositional relation to each other. Us, them, we're inside, you're outside, build a wall, keep them out. All of that is part of the idea of colonialism. If we look at these three things, I also think that we could think of them, and they are architectural acts, right? The idea of how we draw lines, how we think of centers, how we think of symmetry, how we think of inside, outside, we're always thinking about those things. So we need to kind of dismantle this system, this way of thinking. And so in this map, what the map is the triangulation of every federal Indian reservation in the US, and then the top 50 by population are the ones that are highlighted. And you'll see that most of them are pushed to the west. Some of them are where people were indigenous to, but a lot of them are spaces, especially in this sort of Oklahoma area, Trail of Tears, where everyone was placed into that particular part of the US. One of the things that I think fuels, if not exclusively, fuels, exacerbates, amplifies, augments colonialism is a lack of empathy. It is the one fundamental thing that we could change to begin to dismantle the system. If we were more empathetic, we would start to be able to dismantle the system. We would begin to see that there isn't an us and a them, that we're in this together, that in order for us to break down these systems of colonization, that's where we need to be, right? We need to begin to think about that. So we really need to be thinking about the people that are indigenous to this land, the landscape that we're all in, and we're all starting to occupy, and then where we exist. So this last project that I want to share with you is a research project, is ongoing. I've been working on this for a few years, but started with a grant that I received, a research grant from my university. And in the grant, I was looking at the American Indian occupation of Alcatraz Island, which happened from November of 1969 to June of 1971. It was started by a group of indigenous students, and this was a time when Alcatraz was decommissioned as a prison, was put in the federal government land surplus. the treaty with the Lakota people called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. I think the date is 1868. I might be wrong about the date, but in the treaty, the U.S. government says to the Lakota people, any land that we deem a surplus, you can have it. That's why these students took this land, Alcatraz Island, because it was surplus. It was promised in the treaty. They negotiated in good faith with President Nixon, Governor Reagan to take the island. And in taking the island, they didn't take it for political or financial gain. What they actually wanted to do was to build an indigenous university, indigenous cultural center, indigenous ecological center. And I was really compelled by the idea that what they wanted was architecture. They wanted architecture to happen on the island. So in my proposal, I presupposed that they got what they wanted, and I was going to design this native university for 1,491 students. One of the things that's really important on the island, and some of it is still there, the graffiti that was created and placed on the island. This is one of the pieces of graffiti from one of the buildings. It's my favorite piece. So this idea of an acts of resistance, that rhetoric is really important, that the words and graffiti, signs, Black Lives Matter, those kinds of things are really important in these acts of resistance. And so what they did on the island, they occupied it and they sort of colonized it, right? And so all of the signage that refers to the U.S. and United States, they crossed it out and said, it says, instead of United States property, United Indian property. And some of it says you're on federal land. They changed it to you're on Indian land. Some of, and this on the right, that graffiti is still present. So when I started this project, I really started to think all of the complexities that are embedded within this. I couldn't just simply start designing something without examining all of the complexities. And so what that meant for me was drawing, and how I began to draw started to become very complex. So I made a series of drawings that are thematic. They each have themes. This one is called Trajectories. And so the place that I start with it, I draw all of the edges of every building off. I start to develop a graphic language for how was I going to show sound. This is still an island that's in an active harbor. The trajectories of boat traffic that go by. I had nautical maps. I had aeronautical maps. I'm showing air traffic nomenclature on this thing. I'm showing large pieces of how they surveyed the West Coast. So it didn't, scale doesn't matter. Projection doesn't matter, meaning like, is it a plan? Is it an elevation? Is it a section? Is it perspective? All of this is part of the way of thinking of these. And I draw these on Mylar. I draw on multiple sheets. This is 3 sheets of Mylar. I draw on the front, I draw on the back. I use graphite, colored lead, stickers, all kinds of things on these drawings. But in the underlayers of these drawings, I wanted to pull in how would I interpret this idea of trajectories through indigeneity? And one of those is the Trail of Tears, the idea of a trajectory of death, that these people were literally walked from areas in the Southeast US, right? The Florida, Georgia, Carolinas to Oklahoma were literally walked. Many died in that process. Some settled other areas, but they were marched to this area of Oklahoma called the Great Indian Territory. It's an area that wasn't settled yet. And then I overlaid that with how my people, the Oneida, actually came from New York State. That's where we're indigenous to. And we purchased land in Wisconsin, and we took a pathway that went through Canada. There's a Oneida reservation in Canada. And then in 1822 is when we ended up in Wisconsin, before Wisconsin was a state. So that's part of the underlayer of that drawing. This one is called Territories. And so I started to think about all of the ways that territories are claimed, thinking about and examining all of these maps that I had access to, vegetation maps, landscape, geology. And so part of my research grant was I went to, there's an archive, Golden Gate, because it's a national park, Golden Gate Archive, or I could just go through and find all these maps. And then because it's a federal place, they just give you all the maps on a CD, which had tons of these really great maps. And so I began to think about the other ways that territories are claimed, through petroglyphs, through settlement patterns, and in these drawings too, the ritual of drawing is really important to me. So I might not know exactly what it is that I'm drawing, but I think that drawing will bring out these ideas. And so in some of these cases, what you're seeing is that act happening within this drawing. Meaning, I think as architects, we don't always have to think of what the thing is, then represent it, right? to say that the designed object exists somewhere and then we're always representing that. What if there's a reciprocity between the representation and the object, that the object can actually come out of the drawing? That's one of the things that I'm examining in this drawing. The other thing in this idea of territories, I'm looking at land secession, which is basically a fancy word for stolen land, right? I'm looking at the Great Lakota Nation, which was this boundary that was established by the federal government. They said this is the Great Lakota Nation, and then they came in, they shrunk that in 1868, 1877. They shrunk it again. They shrunk it another time, and then they finally shrunk it down to the federal reservation boundaries, which are shown here in yellow. This is the Standing Rock Reservation at the top here, and then my reservation. The Oneida Reservation in Wisconsin. So when we moved to Wisconsin in 1822, we actually purchased this land. We bought it with the Menominee Nation. The Menominee are indigenous to this area. Purchased that amount of the land. It's a huge part of the state, right? That's pretty clear in 1822. 1831, federal government comes in and says, well, you can't have that. What you can have is this other piece here. So that piece is, we purchased that piece of land. And then in 1838, the federal reservation boundary was established. And then we purchased that land. We purchased the land that we existed on 3 times. And then in the late 1800s, the Dawes Act, we lost all of the land. If there are people that settled that land before, they, whites, European settlers, they owned the land. We don't own 100% of that land. The lowest percentage I think it was ever at was near 10%. I don't know exactly what the percentage is now. It's higher, but it's definitely not up to 50%. We don't own all of that land. That Dawes Act was a federal act that was established to basically steal land from tribal members. So that's the underlayer of this drawing. Begin to think about the idea of places like Acoma Pueblo. We're not talking about this in Cahokia and places like it as the first cities in the US. We're not talking about these as the first multi-story buildings in the US. We're not talking about that in our architectural history courses, and we should be. When we talk about American architecture, this is where we should start, and it's not part of our history. We're not thinking about those things. We're not talking about Chaco Canyon in a similar way as being a very sophisticated structure, a very sophisticated masonry structure that rivaled what the Romans were doing, and there's no way they could have known what they were doing, right? There's no way that the Anasazi could have known what the Romans were doing. They figured out how to make apertures. They figured out how to make lintels. They figured out how to make and align openings with the sun and the moon, how to make round masonry structures. We're not talking about that in our building technology courses, right? We're not thinking about all of those things. We're not talking about petroglyphs. The amount of petroglyphs is a group that are 3D scanning this to preserve these, but the idea that these petroglyphs were ways of telling stories and claiming these territories of multiple peoples that might have crossed the landscape, we're not talking about that. So one of the things also that I am sort of indexing in this drawing is 12/29/1890, which is the massacre that happened at Wounded Knee. This is an image from that massacre, and it is literally a massacre. At least 300 indigenous people lost their lives that day. And what you're looking at, this is the US government. This is the United States Army. And this is what they did. This is in the dead of winter. They buried people in this mass grave. Of those 300 people, more than 200 of them were women and children. The men were out fighting the rest of the army. Now, the other thing that I think is really profound about, if you think about this photograph, they thought that this was so important, they had to document it in this photograph. This is a very complicated relationship that indigenous people have with the United States government. In order for us to get anywhere, to any point of reconciliation, we have to be talking about these things. The United States government has never used the word genocide in relation to indigenous people. Canadian government has. US government, I don't believe, has ever used the word. This is what we need to be thinking about. So for me, those things are so important that they need to be a part of the drawing, but I don't need to have the imagery in the drawing. That's why I index it through the date that's on the drawing. So the project now is in the stage where I'm doing these massing studies, designing this university. I'm really thinking about this idea of like, how can architecture really be like an animal? How can it inhabit this landscape? How could we begin to see it in that sort of way? The bear's ears, could we begin to tell stories of it? So this university is for 1,491 students, and will coexist with the national park aspect of the island. The southern end of the island is where I'm proposing to place this thing. So I think these three things: design is ceremony, drawing is medicine, and decolonization. This can be the basis for an architectural curriculum. We could begin to think about these things. I think we should be thinking about these things, not just like drawing in our representation classes, and not just about indigeneity in our history classes, but in our building technology classes. I give a lecture to our second year undergrad students about materials. And I say to them basically that, you're only 2 years, this is your second year into your architectural education. You probably really don't know that many materials. You might know brick and concrete and steel. So let's talk about characteristics and qualities. I use all animal analogies. And when I talk about mass, I talk about the bear. When I talk about transparency and translucency, I use jellyfish, right? The idea that we start to draw these analogies and we start to really connect ourselves with nature and thinking about all of these things, I think we could begin to think about that. This is how we begin to really decolonize curriculum. We have to really examine what we have been taught and how we're teaching it, and where are these systems within it? Like, how do we start to dismantle that system? And I think it can happen through the entire curriculum. I don't think it's just a history lesson thing. I think we should be doing it in design studio and all of our courses, technology courses. We should be thinking about these ideas. So I want to leave you with this. This is the 2-row wampum belt from 1613. And it is what it is. So there was a disagreement between the Dutch and the Mohawk. The Mohawk are part of the Haudenosaunee. And they came to this realization that we have to figure out how to coexist. We have to figure out, like, how are we going to exist within this landscape? And so they decided that they were going to respect each other 100%. Meaning, like, they had presence. The Mohawk had right to the land. The Dutch were there trying to settle it. They were trading with one another. They have to respect one another as equals. So the Dutch put it into writing in a treaty that they signed. The Mohawk made this wampum belt to signify this. And it is the 2-row belt. So what the 2 dark lines represent are the 2 canoes. The one canoe of the Dutch and the one canoe of the indigenous people. And that they are parallel, that they run together, that they'll always be together. Sometimes they might come close to one another. They might need each other, but they'll never cross each other. And so I see my architectural education as existing in those 2 canoes. I have to straddle both canoes. When the waters get rough, I have to jump in one canoe or the other. Sometimes it's the indigenous canoe. Sometimes as a faculty member, it's the non-indigenous canoe. This is how I begin to balance my own education. When I show you these images of the things on the right that are non-indigenous that I've learned as an architect, and the things on the left that I know as an indigenous person and how I see the world, this is how I balance these things. I realized just recently as I was writing something, my 4 years of undergrad, 2 years of grad school, I never saw anything indigenous, nothing, anywhere in any curriculum, anywhere. I had to invent that myself. I had to make these parallels between these 2 things. And so I think these things can coexist. I think that we can embed these things, and we can begin to think about indigenous people and non-indigenous people having this equal relationship that we've agreed to have through treaties that you would normally have with other countries. We can coexist in this way. Yawako, thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was great. It's always great to see your work and hear you speak and hear about your thoughts. I think we have a couple questions already. There's one that came through the chat that I'll kick it off with and give everybody else a little time to formulate their questions. So from the chat that's got submitted, can you tell us how the idea of time or the theory of time in Native American cultures is different from maybe, what we perceive in Western cultures? And what do you think how do you think it has an impact in architecture that's kind of conceived under that notion of time?
So indigenous people see time as a continuum. It's actually part of a long process. It's not like things, you know, even in the creation story, for instance, like there's a sky world. And in the story, it talks about the sky world being exactly like this world that we know. So there isn't like a big bang, sort of like this is where everything started, sort of a way of thinking about time. We also think about time in very long periods, right? Like multiple generations. I think like Deb Haaland in her confirmation, she talked about she is part of 35 generations of New Mexicans, right? Like no one can really say that they've occupied the land for 35 generations. I also think that indigenous people are futurists, that we've always been thinking about the future, because in our culture, in Haudenosaunee culture, we talk about the 7 generations. If you're making something and doing things and thinking about the 7th generation, if you're always thinking about that 7th generation, there's a sort of it's going to happen in perpetuity, right? So this idea of time. So I think if we thought about that as designers too, if we thought about like, how are we connected to long periods of time and how are we progressing or projecting ourselves into the future? If we thought about buildings as like, these are the future artifacts. So why not, shouldn't they reflect what's happening in the 21st century? They shouldn't just only be like watered down copies of things that have been done in the past. How have we learned from the past? How are we making current artifacts? So I think, you know, as designers, that's how we should be thinking about time and thinking about it in really long stretches of time and long periods of time.
I see Cruz has his hand up. You want to ask, turn your mic on, Cruz?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for amazing. Oh, sorry, I got somehow somebody's calling. This kind of weird. Sorry. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I think it's fantastic the reading of. I love a lot of the things you were talking about, including the jokester part of the argument. And I have a question, maybe more particular to how do you see your practice evolving and your understanding of a position of indigeneity within the discourse of architecture within the institutions. At some point, you talk about working with the institution, right? Like a lot of these land grant universities are. All the treatises were forced somehow, so nobody's willing to give the land away. So it's a violently sort of stolen land, right? So that's also something that we have to acknowledge. And I'm curious, when you were working with some of those installations that are really beautiful, but also very temporary. So there's an aspect that perhaps challenges the conception of architecture as we understand it through the modernist canon or our sort of settler colonial paradigms, where we feel like we own the land and then we build buildings that are permanent to last 100 years, 200 years, right? Erasing histories, taking over, violently displacing people. And my question was, is there something else that you've been thinking about? Is that something that you would like to pursue, even if you had the opportunity to engage with larger projects where there's a different understanding to the relationship of most settler colonizers to the land versus temporality versus the sort of cyclicality, relationality that you talk about? And something that struck me a lot in your project was when I saw the pavilion in front of the Sarmian church, right? Understanding that the church is such a white supremacist settler colonial institution, right? So it has this really clear contrast between the institution of settler colonialism and some sort of different proposal that is kind of using the institution to present itself. Maybe an antithesis or a different narrative. Is that something that you're pursuing, something that you're thinking about? Do you think that there's a possibility of pursuing that through a way of thinking about architecture that is not through this sort of a way to irreversibly change the environment?
Yeah, I do. So I'll start with like, you know, how my career is. I think of it, I hope, is like a sort of bow tie shape, meaning I started with a huge project. I started with this huge project with Antoine Predock. Like, this is a big institutional project, tens of millions of dollars, right? And now I'm doing like, or somewhere, I've got to this point where I'm starting to do these installations. So it's backwards of what you see a lot of people doing, right? They get out of school, started our practice, like do some installations. Some people have been doing that for years. I don't know what's going to happen. I feel like I wanted to like go back. Like, I want to be able to say, okay, this is what I did. And, 18 years ago, this April is when I started that project. So now I want to, and all of the installation work for me has been embedding in the models, the drawings, everything has been, okay, I'm testing these things out. Fingers crossed, I have been involved in more bigger projects now. I'm chasing bigger projects. Big firms are coming to me to team up with them to go after some of these larger institutional projects. So I hope in the next 5 to 10 years, you start to see me being involved in some of those projects. The other thing is that right now, most of my clients are non-Indigenous. They're non-Indigenous clients that want something Indigenous. I'm doing a permanent piece at a small college here in Wisconsin at Lawrence University. We're going to finish that in May. I'm actually doing a piece here at UWM on my own campus, a permanent piece. So I'm doing 2 permanent pieces, some master planning things, like other sorts of things. I think these things can translate. And for me, the answer is always in that 2-row belt, right? I think these things can coexist. I think that the idea, meaning like I can start to, and I want to work on bigger institutional projects. I think that we have to chip away at this thing. And I have really recently, and it's this great coincidence that, Keith started the sort of presentation out that way. I have been thinking about this issue of the land grant colleges, because someone wrote an article called the land grab colleges or universities or whatever, right? And there are cases where, Indigenous people have won large cash settlements, but they've turned them down to say, we want the land, we don't want the money. So could we start there? What if we started to give the land back and started to make, these were the places that we started to make Indigenous architecture. What if I was hired to design, I don't know, the new law school at Virginia Tech? I could do that. Why not? This is what I've been working for. Because for me, it's always been important to be a good architect. First, be a good designer, not just be the Indigenous guy. Like, I'm not interested in that. I'm always going to be Indigenous. But why not me? Like, why can't I be a part of these projects? I do think that these things are opportunities then for me to be able to talk about these issues of colonization, of indigeneity. How do we get more Indigenous people into architecture? How do we get more Indigenous people into these other professions? There are a lot of Indigenous people in law because there's just a lot of Indigenous law. Why don't we have as many Indigenous people in architecture? So for me, yes, I see my career I'm trying to build a practice where I can expand it to begin to think about these larger projects. How do I translate the same things that I did in the Trickster into into the Virginia Law School, right? Like, how could I say something about the people that were Indigenous to Virginia in that place, right? Or some other school at UVA or wherever it is. I think I'm trying to build this methodology for being able to do that. Thanks.
Another question came through the chat here. I'll read to you. How do you mediate between the concept of built work returning to nature and the inherent permanence of architecture projects? For instance, he mentioned that the Indian Community School wanted a 100-year building. Mm-hmm. So how do you mediate those 2 sides of the equation?
Well, I think we think about that first, right? Like, we have to think about the afterlife of the building. What will happen to it? Like, are we designing things that will end up in the landfill, or things that are going to be dismantled or demolished? And what are the things of that? I had the great experience of, like, my first job out of grad school was with Bill McDonough. And I learned so much from him and learned so much by working in that office that I started to think, and this is when he started to develop this cradle to cradle concept. We were part of that sort of thinking. But for me, again, I was thinking like, how does this apply to indigenous people? But I think it's true of all of architecture. So if we thought about buildings again, and all of our relatives, birds, animals, like we spend a lot of time as architects to keep birds off of buildings. Well, what if we did make a building that was a habitat? What if that was a good thing? What if we started to not see that as a nuisance, but we saw it as a part of its life? Can the thing, while it's existing, be a part of a greater sort of narrative or greater life story than just the people that come in and out of it every day? And if we started to think about materials, where materials come from, like one of the things I learned in Bill McDonough's office, we didn't use anything. There's no vinyl, anything that nothing contained vinyl, anything that got specified. We really had discussions about all the formaldehydes that are in plywoods and everything else, and specifying formaldehyde free products. Like, thinking about that, like even the people that make the things, the people that are manufacturing the products too, and thinking about that as well. As much as we can do to think about those issues, I think we would be better off, even if it's just a little bit. It doesn't have to be like everything is LEED Gold or LEED Platinum. It's just like, how can we as designers start to think about these issues, and where are we going to compromise? Where are we not going to compromise in relation to how long this thing is going to be on the planet?
Matthias, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Chris, for such an amazing lecture. So in regards to seeing the landscape and designing with and around it with empathy, or as part of our family, how do non-Indigenous students or practitioners begin to view the landscape this way, through this Indigenous lens, having never grown up to see it this way?
Mm-hmm. So this is where I see kind of my role. This is like when I talk about animals as analogies to materials, like beginning to understand they're having a role. And this is where you, in my ideal architectural curriculum, you would learn this throughout the curriculum. You would learn about the idea or notion that what you're doing is affecting animals, right? So one of the projects that the Indian Community School is still a client of mine 18 years later. So I've designed multiple things for them. One of the things I designed was a boardwalk that went over this sort of wetland. And it required large, huge earth moving machines to like reconfigure the pond in order to make multiple ponds. And when the guys that were running the machines started, I was out there the first day, and I just told them that our relatives are in this wetland right now. We have explained to them, and the students did this through ceremony. We've explained to them that we're going to disturb your house right now, but we're going to make it better. So when you're moving these machines around, think about the fact that you might be moving someone's house. So you should treat the land in that way, not just like going through and digging and throwing things around, but just to think about that as you're moving these machines around. I think that that's true. It can be true. You don't have to be Indigenous to be able to learn to think like that. Obviously, it has bigger resonance and greater resonance for us as Indigenous people, because we're kind of really spiritually and wholeheartedly tied to that. But if you thought about they're your relatives too. If we started to think about, and not just like animals, we think of stones as living. My thing is, again, let's think, if we thought of buildings as if we were related to them, existing buildings as if we were related to them, how are we treating them? Just thinking about that, this is the way you learn empathy, right? It's not just a lecture on empathy. This is how you begin to learn empathy in designing. And when you're making things, you're fabricating things, you're learning these things in history and your HVAC course and your structures course, and you might think about nature as the structure of nature, right? This is where I think that those things should be embedded in curriculum. Thanks.
We're close to 8:30 here. I'll just, last call for questions, I guess. If nobody else has any questions, thanks again for joining us and sharing your work and talking with us. answering our questions. It's been great to have you. Yeah, thank you.
Good. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.